You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 1st of May 2025 on Monocle Radio.
The US-Ukraine mineral deal is done, but who does it help? Can Syria's new regime hold the country together if it is determined to pull itself apart? And should small, screen-dazed children be reacquainted with picture books and building blocks? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nina Dos Santos and Renard Mansour will discuss the day's big stories. We'll have the latest on the resignations of the US National Security Advisor and his deputy, and our weekly letter is a postcard from Versailles. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor, and Renard Mansour, senior research fellow of the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Nina, you first of all have recently been to one of the destinations we will be discussing later, but you missed the story.
That's right. Rare for me. Portugal. I was in Lisbon just at the tail end of the Easter holidays. And just as I got back, obviously all the power went down and my in-laws who lived there were plunged into romantic darkness for about, 12 hours. But it was actually the thing that panicked everybody was the fact that the telecommunications lines went down across large parts of the Iberian Peninsula. I think that was what really shocked people about that big outage.
What did you glean from what did you glean really about how people passed the time?
I think different countries behave differently in the sense that obviously in Spain this has become intensely political, largely because it's a much bigger country, because obviously the population is much bigger and it's more divided. But actually Portugal was the one that suffered most, really, because it was knocked offline for quite a bit longer through no reason of their own. You know, the power outage actually started in Spain and spread to the rest of the network across the Iberian Peninsula and knocked out parts of southwestern France's electricity provision as well. And so I suppose the lesson from it really is, the interconnected nature of these grids and the fact that not enough investment is made in them. Portugal invests some of the least amounts of those three countries in maintaining its electricity grid. The one thing I would say, though, is that obviously there's more bigger cities in Spain. In Portugal, it's largely just Lisbon and Porto. And outside of those cities, even Lisbon's only, 1 million people, people do tend to have their own solar power and their own generators. So I think that mitigated things, certainly for my in-laws who live outside of Lisbon.
Renard, you have been visiting Washington, D.C. and attempting to glean the foreign policy thinking of the Trump administration. Is it perhaps not just the Spanish and the Portuguese who should be stocking up on sandbags and tinned food?
Well, I think anyone who's trying to make sense of the U.S. Foreign policy or U.S. policy in general would be confused. And our hope going there was to try and understand a bit more, but I think we left with more questions than answers. It's a government in flux, as you see with the resignation now of the National Security Advisor. And it is, a dramatic transformation of the U.S., but also the global system. This is quite transformative, what's happening in the U.S. with the changes in the State Department, changes across the government. And there will be a different world order after this.
Do you know, though, and I realise there would be a long answer to this question, but the shortest one you can manage, what they envisage that world order actually looking like?
I mean, I can tell you what they say they envision. It's hard to kind of come up with a grand strategy of sort of what, Trump administration at the moment. I don't think anyone can. But what they say they envision is the world is far more transactional. The kind of ideological blocks that emerged after World War II were not benefiting the U.S. And so it's a kind of back to basics. What do we get out of it? And that's what we constantly heard going from country to country. What do we get out of our investments? And you see that with the Ukraine, the deal that was signed on the resources. This is what they want, a pragmatic, economic-focused, issue-by by issue basis, not this grand, we are the West, we are the democracies of the world. No. Who's our broker? Who can we work with? And how do we get our interests best met?
Well, first to the United States, where, as we have been discussing, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz can console himself that he lasted longer than the first National Security Advisor of President Donald Trump's first term, whereas Mike Flynn was given the boot after barely 3 weeks when caught being somewhat evasive about his dealings with a Russian diplomat. Waltz and his deputy Alex Wong appear to be the designated scapegoats for the copying in of the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic on imminent military action. Well, a short while ago, I spoke to Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic, and I began by asking Tom if he had an immediate reaction to Waltz and his deputy's departure.
I think it was inevitable. I think Trump was going to fire Waltz after some kind of decent interval. He wasn't going to do it, on demand from people he thinks are his enemies. But it's important to remember two things. First, Mike Waltz is not from Trump world. Not really one of his people. So it kind of makes it, unlike Pete Hegseth, for example, who Trump feels very warmly about. Waltz was always kind of, suspect in that sense, and particularly with his aides like Alex Wong, who were on a kind of MAGA hit list for a while to get fired. The other is that in the American system, the National Security Advisor serves at the pleasure of the president and doesn't need Senate confirmation. So Waltz was the easy guy to fire, even though Hegseth's behavior was much more egregious. If you fire a cabinet secretary, then you have to have the Senate agree to confirm a new cabinet secretary. Whereas with somebody like the National Security Advisor, who serves within the executive office of the president, and the National Security Council, Trump can hire and fire these guys at will, just as he did in his first term, where he had several national security advisors almost on a kind of revolving door.
When Waltz was announced as National Security Advisor, he, along with perhaps Secretary of State Marco Rubio, was hailed with a certain amount of relief in some quarters as a relatively orthodox choice, the kind of person you could imagine most any Republican president giving that job. If he was only there on sufferance for perhaps that reason, should we be braced for the idea that he might be succeeded by somebody a bit more MAGA-friendly?
I think we're going to have to totally brace for the fact that his replacement could be worse. Laura Loomer is already taking a victory lap here. Laura Loomer, the kind of, kooky right-wing conspiracy theorist who marched into the Oval Office and demanded that all of these people be fired. You would hope that Trump would want to calm the waters. That he doesn't need a lot of, personnel disruption, but that's never really bothered Trump. And so, right now the news reports are that one of the names being floated is Steve Witkoff, his envoy to Russia and Iran. And, Steve Witkoff, as we've learned, doesn't really know anything about foreign policy, doesn't really know anything about national security affairs, probably wouldn't know how to run a National Security Council meeting if his life depended on it. So, could the replacement be worse? I think, it almost certainly will be, unless somebody in the, Susie Wiles, the chief of staff, or somebody has an attack of sort of, sensibility and comes up with somebody who is more like Waltz. Because you're absolutely right, Andrew. He and Rubio were going to be the two adults in the room this time around. And neither of them have played that role yet.
That was Tom Nichols at The Atlantic speaking to me earlier. There will be more on this story on tomorrow morning's edition of The Globalist. Do tune into that. For now, you are listening to The Daily and to Ukraine and the signing of a much-telegraphed deal with the United States to share in whatever bounty may be extracted from Ukraine's soil once hostilities are concluded. The deal is advertised as a win-win, i.e. the US gets a return on its considerable recent investment in Ukraine's defence, and Ukraine acquires the reassurance which comes with knowing that the United States now has a direct stake in its security. If, however, the Ukrainian negotiators have troubled to read a couple of biographies of President Trump the businessman, they would know not to spend the promised returns just yet. Nina, first of all, is there on the face of it, necessarily anything wrong with this. Countries go into partnership with bigger, richer countries to exploit their natural resources for hopefully mutual benefit all the time.
Yeah, but Ukraine's having to agree to this from a very weak position, isn't it? And ostensibly, President Trump says that the United States is on the hook for $175 billion. There's a bit of debate about how much money really the US has spent on the war in Ukraine and thus far, and how much of it was aid, how much of it was effectively an economic loan that President Trump, as a new administration, who didn't originally sign those checks because they came under the Biden administration, wants to cash in on. So there's a feeling, yes, of course, that Ukraine has sort of been bullied into this situation, but Ukraine, of course, knows that if the US doesn't provide it with the weaponry it needs to defend itself, Russia will just, make headway on the battlefield, which has been happening. Now, obviously, this has finally, been signed through. We've had the first consignment of US military aid be waved through in the Trump administration. So that'll be a big sigh of relief to those in Kyiv who say that aid is definitely needed to try and keep the Russian troops at bay.
Renard, Ukraine will be hoping that it is safer for having signed this deal, is it?
Well, this is the read that most governments have made on the Trump administration. Give them a deal. That's the way to talk to the Trump administration. That's the way to talk to Washington. And it's very obvious. It's very transactional, but it's also creating interdependencies because now there is an economic link between the Trump administration, the U.S. and Ukraine. In the context where it became clear in the early days that the Trump administration wants to end this war, wants to make a deal with Putin, and wants to have better relationships with Putin, this put Ukraine in a very bad position. And so this could support Ukraine. I think it was an important play in developing some kind of interdependency, making Ukraine somewhat valuable in the eyes of a Trump administration that might have seen more value in Putin previously.
Nina, we have seen prior to the last 3 years at least successive efforts by Europe to create economic dependencies or interdependencies with Russia, obviously, which didn't work out terribly.
On energy security, you mean?
Exactly, which didn't work out terribly well eventually. But in the current context, is it imaginable that a similar transactional approach could work on the other side of this conflict? I mean, could an economic incentive be offered to Russia in return for them knocking it off?
Well, who knows? Or will President Trump sort of tighten the screws economically on Russia to say, well, look, it's your turn. The ball's in your court. You're going to have to, lay down your arms because now Ukraine has signed on to this. We're on their side, and we're going to tighten the sanctions as opposed to releasing them, because that obviously is what the Trump administration has made it very clear it ultimately wants to do. It ultimately wants peace in Ukraine and for relations with Russia economically to be somewhat normalized. Now, whether or not we're going to see a U-turn on that from the White House, it's not entirely clear. When it comes to this particular deal, it's obviously the White House is viewing Ukraine as an opportunity to get access to those type of critical minerals like rare earths and so on and so forth that China is trying to hoard in other parts of the world. So this is part of a sort of long-term strategic play. As Renard was just saying, it's about sort of creating that economic interdependency. But, from the Ukrainians' point of view, they have a lot of suspicions about the United States being more on Russia's side, even despite this economic interdependency, than they are on Ukraine's side, and whether or not they're a trustworthy partner.
And Renard, to bring this back to your recent interactions with the Trump administration, and it is an eternal question which is going, I suspect, to hang over this administration for ever long it lasts, which is, even if they do sign an agreement or sign a treaty or sign anything, how much should anybody really be willing to bet on it? Because we have seen more than once that Donald Trump is capable of changing his mind several times before breakfast.
Well, I think the Iranians learned that lesson years ago when the Trump administration then ripped apart the nuclear deal, the Iranian nuclear deal, which was Obama's deal. So certainly, yes, in this more transactional world where decisions are being made on such an issue, such an economic, such an issue-based basis where you don't really have, everyone is multi-aligned, everyone's looking for the best deal. It's much more chaotic. And in that chaotic world, a better deal could come up. And we've seen with the Trump administration, there aren't spheres of influence. There aren't these poles. And so I think this is where the world is going in general. So in a world where there aren't poles, these kind of these economic processes become even less rigid because there could be a bigger deal. So I think that's right. I think that it's an important move to create an interdependency because that's how this kind of globalized system works. But it's also at a time that's very chaotic and it's uncertain.
Well, to Syria now, and since the startling toppling of President Bashar al-Assad late last year and his replacement by a regime of people claiming to be very much former jihadists, there has been considerable and understandable anxiety in Syria and abroad about whether it will prove possible to discourage a diverse country from the temptations of sectarian vengeance. Another disheartening omen has manifested this week in the form of clashes in Damascus between militias attached to Syria's Sunni majority and its tiny Druze minority. The spark appears to have been an allegedly blasphemous recording of dubious provenance widely shared on social media. At least 40 people were killed. Renard, first of all, this follows, of course, those anti-Alawite pogroms we saw in March, which left at least 1,500 people dead, which both incidents, or both sets of incidents, I guess, prompt the question, is the regime not trying to stop this, or is the regime just not capable?
So I think we need to separate those two incidents. But before we do that, certainly we need to remember that Syria historically is a very difficult country to govern.
Indeed.
And it took, this 5-decade-long Assad regime that was so brutal and so centralized and, to be able to try and control this difficult governing space. And so what you have now is this vacuum that has emerged following the fall of the Assad regime with this new government under Ahmed al-Shara, who is trying to get their bearings on power. They don't control the entire country. And have grievances, particularly against the Alawis, which is the sort of earlier incidents of a violence where they believe the Alawis to be connected to the Assad regime. And so they certainly will do just like we saw in Iraq with de-Baathification, a kind of de-Assadification, and the Alawis will be the primary targets of that. Then you have the Druze, which is this recent incident, where the Druze are a community that live in Syria, in Israel, and in Lebanon, and they happen to have some relations with Israel. And keep in mind that since the fall of Assad, Israel had made huge gains in Syria. It has destroyed much of the military infrastructure of Syria. It's taken advantage of the vacuum. And so there is going to be these, I think it'll get more violent. There's going to be much more conflict in the streets. And the reality is that the current government doesn't have the ability to control this type of security.
Well, on that happy thought, Nina, obviously, as Renard has suggested, there are many countries immediately around Syria which do have an interest in it, or at least are taking an interest in it, Israel and Turkey perhaps most obviously. But beyond that, do you get the sense that the wider West, which obviously did play a large role in the previous version of Syria's civil war, is just hoping that somehow they're not going to have to think about this?
Yeah, I think that's probably a very acute assessment, unfortunately. The United States has completely retrenched itself from the Middle East, hasn't it? With the exception, of course, various unpalatable pronouncements from Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump on Gaza and the future of Gaza as they envisage it, which again is very transactional, as you mentioned, Renard, as a vision, and Iran. And when it comes to Syria, I think they've just completely detached themselves. Unless I'm wrong, Renard, it appears as though they've left it to this struggle between those two crucial countries. Israel getting more involved via the Jews, who of course are crucial because as a minority both in Israel but also in Syria and Lebanon, they straddle that Golan Heights border. And Turkey, which has obviously sponsored the change of regime in Syria.
I mean, what is Israel's interest, particularly with the Druze in Syria? Because there have been reports this week, Renard, of airstrikes launched by Israel to defend the Druze amid these recent clashes. Is it just sheer opportunism on Israel's part? Do they, in fact, hope to help themselves to more of Syria's territory? Or is Israel just calculating that a weak and chaotic and hapless regime in Damascus is better for them in the long run?
Well, the Israel-Turkey relationship is important here. So yes, Israel is certainly trying to make sure that there is a massive buffer zone between its borders and what comes next in Syria, but also that Turkey doesn't become too powerful. There is this kind of paranoia of a neo-Ottoman Middle East where Turkey has, at the end of 2024, is becoming a regional power. And keep in mind that Turkey has been, and Erdogan has been very vocal against Israel with the war on Gaza and since October 7th. So Israel is both concerned about Turkey's resurgence regionally. Also, what happens with Iran is still, a concern, and Iraq here also, because as Israel increases its buffer zone, it gets closer to Iraq, it gets closer to Iran. So there's all sorts of considerations there. But I think you're right. At a core, it's what comes next in Syria. And I don't think Israel wants to just sit and wait to see what comes next, but wants to impact that. And it will probably be to destabilize any type of process that would lead to a government antagonistic to Israel.
Well, to Portugal and Spain, and a big welcome back to our listeners across the Iberian Peninsula who can once again do things like download their favourite current affairs podcast. Power is by and large back on after this week's extraordinary nationwide blackouts, which means that for engineers and analysts, the tiresome, painstaking work of determining the cause can commence, while politicians and pundits undertake the vastly more enjoyable task of speculating inanely regarding the cause and ascribing blame to each other. Nina, as we were saying at the top of the show, you were just there, just before the blackout. God, it would have been exciting if you'd been there. We could have heard all about it.
No, you couldn't, because I wouldn't have been able to call you. Let's be honest.
But how much of a warning to Europe should this be? Because we've had a couple of, at a much smaller scale here in the UK, Heathrow Airport closed down by what seemed like a very small fire in a not terribly spectacular electrical substation. This should cause a bit more concern, shouldn't it?
Yeah, well, so with regards to the situation, obviously, in the Iberian Peninsula, it appears as though, just to remind your listeners what happened, it seems as though there was some oscillation in sudden loss of power in southwestern Spain, and that spread across the grid, and then it knocked out Portugal, knocked out the power connection to parts of Spain, lots of Spain, if not all of it, and then parts of southwestern France. So essentially something happened to fail in southwestern Spain, and that caused it to, spread across the Iberian Peninsula into southwestern France. But we don't know. Now, the authorities say, or at least the electrical grid company says, that they believe it was not a cyber attack. Because obviously most people's immediate thoughts went straight to the concept of hybrid warfare, because we know that, state actors like, for instance, Russia, allegedly try and target our grids all the time with cyber attacks. But it appears as though what may have happened here is that there was some kind of climate factor that caused an oscillation of current. There's been question marks over whether or not renewable energy has caused this sort of fluctuating current, because remember that Spain and Portugal on that very day were relying upon renewable solar and wind energy, because that's what they've been developing across the Iberian Peninsula, for 80% of their power on that particular day. So it's caused a big political ruckus, particularly in Spain. Pedro Sanchez, who's been in power since 2018 and is facing all sorts of question marks over, whether or not he's holding on to power too long with a fragile government, has been trying desperately to deflect the blame. He's been accusing the grid operator of not being clear on what has happened, not essentially casting aspersions on whether or not they're engaging in a cover-up. The head of that electricity network has said, I'm not going to resign. She's a former Socialist Party minister, by the way, which is also important because she's politically connected. And I think we're going to see a real political blame game ratcheting up in Spain over the next few weeks over this.
Renard, a 24-hour outage caused by things beyond people's control, it's not the end of the world. It will doubtless have caused considerable distress and inconvenience to a lot of people, but it doesn't bring about the complete collapse of civilization. But when you think about the possibilities of cyber attacks and start to think about what 4 or 5 days without power could look like in big cities, the prospect does become somewhat alarming. Is that something, or that sort of prospect, something that European governments could be doing more to tell people to prepare for?
Definitely. And they themselves should also be preparing better for this. I think it's a glimpse of how vulnerable our societies have become to such attacks or to sort of technologies, electricities. It stops the way that we live these days. And it is a new form of warfare. It's a new form of, military campaigns. And we've seen through the years how, adversaries of the UK and the US have used technologies, have used hybrid warfare in a way to impact elections, to impact the politics, to impact daily life. All of this fake news and artificial AIs, we're living in a frontier that these governments, European governments, just don't have a solid grasp over, and it is quite it is quite scary how this could be used. So yes, I think it is interesting the conspiracies that immediately came out. Now in this case, it wasn't that, but certainly the governments need to be doing more to protect their citizens from the exposure to these to this new way of life.
Well, to France now, where boffins are urging parents to prize phones, tablets and laptops from the pâté-smeared fingers of their younger offspring and reacquaint them with the infanthood pursuits that made France great, such as playing the accordion and smoking. In a sensationally French declaration, the cabal of concerned paediatric health experts said that the younger generation was being, quote, sacrificed on the altar of ignorance, which reminds me of the time I saw the altar of ignorance opening for Sisters of Mercy at the 100 Club. Nina, where are we on this? Are too many parents being too lazy and just outsourcing child rearing to their phones?
Pause. You need a job in stand-up comedy. That was the best entree I've ever heard to a French story. I do know you get quite exercised by French story introductions.
I do.
Andrew, having been on the show a few times.
Just to be clear, it comes from a place of great francophilia. I'm a big fan of it.
Yeah. Well, I was brought up speaking French. I don't remember ever having pâté smeared fingers when I was young. But I didn't have an iPad in them because it didn't exist at the time. I think France is taking a very consistent and brave approach on this particular issue. It's going to set them up for one heck of a fight with Silicon Valley, as we know, because Silicon Valley is spending a lot of time lobbying the European Union in Brussels, and obviously the Trump administration wants to advocate for the tech bros because they helped Donald Trump get into office. And this is all part of the consistent effort you're hearing in France to say, stop allowing your children online with these digital devices. Now, this particular report is actually more draconian than another medical report that was released about 6 months ago, where they said that children under the age of 12, I think, shouldn't have access to any screen and not even TV because it's not good for their brains. I don't think many parents would admit that their kid has never watched TV until the age of 12, even in rural France. A bit like the pâté smeared fingers, by the way. But I do think that, we know that these digital devices are really causing a real problem with the wiring of our young children. I've got 2 young children in primary school age myself. One thing I will say is that it's quite difficult to get them off devices once they know how to use them. And the education curriculum puts them in children's hands. So in British schools, a lot of it is iPad learning inside the school, and you cannot police that.
I mean, Renard, some of the quotes from this report are fabulous, and I'm not going to try and do them in the accent that would do them proper justice, unfortunately. But the devices, and again, I quote, hinder and alter brain development, causing a lasting alteration to their health and intellectual capacities. OK, but similar things have been said along the journey about, I don't know, jazz, rock and roll, hip-hop, television, radio, chewing gum, hula hoops. Is this just the update of that familiar moral panic about what the kids are doing that we didn't when we were kids?
In a very French way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's, of course, you always need parental advisory, parental guidance. I mean, even hip-hop had tried to attempt to have parental guidance. You weren't able to listen to Eminem at the age of 6, I believe. But nonetheless, it's again another frontier. It's children are exposed to learning in a completely different way. I think this is a revolution in bringing up children, and I don't know, maybe I'm biased because I didn't have this, but I think a lot of cognitive critical thinking comes not from being told the exact answer. Sometimes you just want to have an argument and not know what the answer is and spend hours and hours debating it rather than just Googling it and ending that conversation. So I think the process of thinking requires us to go back to the rudimentary human unsophisticated brain and to be able to work these things out, especially at those ages. I think if we go back to this question, so I think in this French way, it is something important. It is something scary to think that kids are just being told answers all the time without actually going through the process of learning that stovetop might be hot.
I just want to come back finally, Nina, to that point you made about how quickly children acclimatise to these devices and learn their way around them. I'm sure very, very often much faster than their parents have. But the alternatives proposed by the concerned French boffins, and again, I want you to imagine pitching this to your primary school age children. Alternatives they suggest include reading aloud, free play, board games, or outdoor games, physical, creative and artistic activities. What if they don't want to?
I've been dealing with that for about 9 years.
I thought you might have been.
I still don't have the answer. Even when I Google it, by the way, Renard, it isn't there. This is the age-old problem. I think it's different if you live, say, in the countryside, in a rural setting, and it's nice and bucolic, you don't get internet connection, for instance. Hey, look, if you're in Portugal and Spain and it all gets turned off for 24 hours, you've got to figure out what to do with the kids. But I think that this is something bigger. This is a fundamental re-altering of young generations' attention span. As Renard said, their ability to engage in critical thinking, their socialisation. And I think I really applaud governments that put health warnings on screens. We've had in the UK successive governments that haven't been able to tackle the food lobby with unhealthy foods, that have been marketed at young children. That's taken years to deal with. Again, lots of those food lobby companies do also come from America. And so I think, the big lobbying money when it comes to Silicon Valley will continue to try and challenge governments around the world. And I applaud countries like France, trying their best to try and... This is not actually about putting guardrails up legally yet. Gabriel Attal, the former French Prime Minister, who may well run as a presidential candidate in the upcoming 2027 presidential elections, he's actually talking about banning social media for children under the age of 15. Already what we're seeing here is an effort by sort of the medical professional lobby to try and start to lay the groundwork to say to parents, look, even before we legislate for this, you have to understand it is terrible for your children to be exposed to these devices at such a young age when their brain has such plasticity.
Nina dos Santos and Renard Mansour, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our weekly letter is from Versailles, from me. Across the street from the actual Palace of Versailles is the Gallery of Coaches. It is, as advertised, a collection of splendid horse-drawn conveyances, including the coronation carriage of King Charles X, the funeral carriage of King Louis XVIII, and those which trundled over the cobbles to the wedding of Emperor Napoleon and Empress Marie-Louise. The building in which these venerable vehicles are parked was built in the late 17th century and was once the royal stables. Just inside the Gallery of Coaches there is a placard bearing a text which distills, advertently or otherwise, the essence of Versailles.
Most European royal families would have happily settled for such buildings as their palace, but for the King of France, these were just his stables.
One can only imagine how the first draft went.
Buckingham Palace, a pigsty. The Schönbrunn, a French king would not keep goats in it. The Palazzo Ducal, a bed and breakfast.
The thing, a thing, is that these opulent contraptions were not exclusively the transports of royalty. Parked just inside the entrance are carriages, admittedly more modest but still ceremonial carriages, built for the presidents of the Third Republic, i.e. 1870 to 1940. In fairness, these were pretty much phased out in favour of motor vehicles by the 1920s, but nevertheless, no French head of state since, the incumbent most certainly not excluded, has been noteworthy for hair-shirted humility. Versailles is an enormously fun place to visit, though crowded enough that the most pious socialist will begin to sympathise with the House of Bourbon's preference for keeping the riffraff on the other side of the gilded gates. It's all very imposing, as was intended. When King Louis-Philippe I clambered onto the French throne amid the upheavals of the early 19th century, he determined to turn Versailles into a museum of French accomplishment and a monument to French grandeur. The palace itself, or the fraction of it you'll get around to seeing, is roughly equal parts magnificent and preposterous, as if decorated under instruction to get as close as possible to the boundaries of good taste and common sense without ever quite stepping over them. The most austere aficionado of minimalist Scandinavian utilitarianism is apt to find themselves yearning for a bedchamber draped in scarlet and gold brocade with a chandelier the size of Belgium. And the gardens are glorious and enormous. The option of seeing them, as they probably should be seen, from an ornate stallion-tugged carriage accompanied by a phalanx of liveried guardsmen is regrettably unavailable. But for €42 an hour you can hire a golf buggy in which to pootle through assorted groves and past the Grand Canal, on which Louis XIV sailed for his own amusement, a considerable fleet, and various subsidiary water features to Marie Antoinette's house and a couple of spare palaces. In the popular imagination, Versailles, colossal, ludicrous Versailles, looms as the emblem of every extravagance your downtrodden sans-culotte is likely to eventually revolt against, before prodding the perfumed tenants towards the guillotine at pitchfork point. And there are moments at which you can kind of see their point. If you were down to your last turnip, it might be a struggle to be charmed by a 90-jet fountain honouring Neptune, Roman god of the seas. But France, modern Republican France, has never quite permitted Versailles into retirement as some cautionary reminder of things past. At some level, France still wishes to be seen as the country which built this. Official functions still occur in the Hall of Mirrors. When joint sessions of France's Parliament convene, they do so in the palace's Congress chamber. However often, however stridently, France pledges itself to égalité, along with liberty and fraternité, the lesson of Versailles is, fundamentally, that France, gone of France. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller. And that's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nina Dos Santos and Renard Mansour, also to Tom Nichols at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.